All right, good day. I am honored to spend this time with you today as we take a look at Scripture together. We're going to be continuing the series in the book of Mark. I love the book of Mark. It is one of my favorite books of the Bible, mostly because Mark does such a fabulous job of keeping the action going. He's a very, very active writer, and so I've always loved the Book of Mark, one of my favorite books. And today we're going to be finishing up with the story of Jesus before the Sanhedrin, just prior to the crucifixion of Jesus. And so what we're going to look at chapter 14, starting in verse 43, and we'll go through chapter 15, verse 15. In fact, if you'd like to, one of the things you could do is you could go ahead and pause right now. And well, not right now, wait till I tell you what to do before you pause, but pause here in a minute and read through chapter 14, verse 43, all the way through chapter 15, verse 15. And that'll kind of give you a picture of what we're talking about today. So I'll just go ahead. So if you want to pause, now is a good time to do that. Pause. And then you can catch up with us here in a minute. Of course, if you pause, you won't have to catch up at all. But here's what's happened here in the Scripture. So Kenny did a good job of bringing us through last week with the story of Jesus at the Last Supper. And so this is the Last Supper has happened. Lots of things have occurred, obviously, through the life and ministry of Jesus, and it's coming towards the end. And Judas, we find here, is the betrayer of Jesus. Now, Judas, it's interesting because the first verse there, chapter 14, verse 43, is the last time that Mark ever mentions the name Judas Iscariot. And so he just continues, he continues to talk about him as not as Judas, but as the betrayer. And so it's kind of interesting in Scripture, anytime you see reference not to somebody's name, but to what they did, what they're doing is they're just not, they don't want to give any credibility to that person, essentially. Just a way of doing that. But so Judas is betrayed. He's betrayed Jesus. Essentially the disciples, it says that they scatter in the midst of all of this because they don't know what to do. Kind of shocked by the whole thing. One of them cuts off an ear of one of the soldiers. Of course, we know that Jesus ends up healing that guy in the book of John, I believe, is where that's found. And so all of this is happening. And then Mark tells us this very interesting story that he throws in the middle of it. I'm not sure it was necessarily comedic relief, but essentially he tells a story about somebody who was watching, got caught, and they grabbed his cloak and he took off and runs stark naked all the way back home. Now, we kind of assume that that's Mark telling a story about himself. So Mark the Streaker is a lot of times what I like to call him. He was streaking before streaking was even popular, and so that's kind of where we find ourselves here. And then now Jesus is arrested. He's being hauled. The first place he goes is to the Sanhedrin. Now, there at his trial before the Sanhedrin, it's before all of the religious people, it's before all the lawgivers, it's before a lot of these people that had followed Jesus pretty closely. A lot of these people that weren't happy about some of the things that they were hearing from Jesus, and so they start to tell stories. And what's interesting is Mark points out, and this is also pointed out in the other Gospels, that a lot of the things that they were saying, it didn't add up. It didn't make sense. The accusations that they were leveling against Jesus essentially didn't hold any water. And so all of this happens, and Jesus says nothing. He doesn't defend himself. Jesus doesn't need to defend himself. That's not why Jesus was here. He wasn't here to produce a defense of his ministry. He just did his thing. And so Jesus is as he is just listening to all of these things. Finally, the leader of the Sanhedrin, he stands up and he's like, "Well, what's the deal, Jesus? Like, what are you going to do about these accusations? You going to say anything about it? You going to say anything about it?" And it's almost like as I read this and I put on my holy imagineering hat, it's almost like he is kind of at the end of his rope because he doesn't have enough to really convict Jesus of blasphemy yet, because all of the stories that everybody's telling, they just don't fit. They're just not working, and he's realizing that this isn't enough to charge this guy with blasphemy yet. And then, kind of like in a last ditch effort, he says to Jesus, he says, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Right? Are you really Jesus? Are you really the Christ? And Jesus says, "I am." Now, there's a whole nother sermon right there that we can go into. We're not going to do that yet, but essentially what Jesus confirms this. It says the high priest tore his garments at the thought of this blasphemy, that he would equate himself with the Christ. So at that point in time, Jesus is officially condemned. He's convicted. Like it's done in the eyes of the Sanhedrin. But here's the deal. They actually have no power to execute Jesus. So the very next thing that they have to do is they have to send Jesus to a guy by the name of Pontius Pilate. Now, in between this is the story of Peter. Peter and his denial of Jesus. And so we're going to kind of skip over that today. But one thing I want you to realize is there is redemption even for Peter. At the end of this story, here in chapter 14, it says that Peter himself broke down and wept. And as we continue to pursue the story of Jesus, I want you to realize that there's redemption for Peter. We're not focusing in on that today, but I want you to realize that there is redemption for Peter. Even denying Jesus 3 times after he told Jesus to his face, "Look, I ain't gonna deny you." He does it, but guess what, man? There's awesome redemption for Peter, which we'll see later on down the road. But back to Jesus's trial. So again, the Sanhedrin has no power. They can't just execute him. They don't have they don't have the ability to do that. It's not written in the law. They're still underneath Roman rule, the Roman government. So they have to take Jesus to this guy by the name of Pontius Pilate. Now, Pontius Pilate is one really bad dude. Now, Pontius Pilate, one of the things that's kind of interesting about Pontius Pilate is he's the governor of this area in Judea, but he doesn't live there. In fact, historically, we see that Pontius Pilate actually lived in a place called Caesarea Maritima, which was located right on the coast of Israel. And so he has to go inland whenever he goes into Jerusalem to spend time there as the governor. And so Pontius Pilate happens to be there. He's there really every year during this feast, because as a political man, he realizes that politically he needs to support the Jewish people in order to make sure that they are kind of on his side. So although he rules with a heavy hand and a heavy fist, one of the blessings that he gives to those people of Jerusalem, to the Jews during that day, they didn't have many rights, but one of the things that he would do is he would free one of the Jewish prisoners and release them just before, on that same time as the Passover. So when Passover came around, he would release one of the prisoners. Okay, so Jesus is brought before Pontius Pilate. Now, in I think it's the book of Luke or Matthew, Pontius Pilate's wife comes to him and says, "Hey, be careful of this Jesus guy. I had some dreams about this Jesus guy, and I don't think you want to touch him. You don't want to touch him with the 10-foot pole. Like, you need to stay out of this," essentially. But Pontius Pilate doesn't listen. Pontius Pilate He's a political man, and he sees an opportunity here, and so he listens to what the Sanhedrin bring before him. And as he listens, one of the things that he notices is that it doesn't seem like it's fitting for an execution. In fact, he begins to question Jesus, and once again, Jesus essentially says nothing. He says nothing until he asks Jesus that same question that Jesus was asked before the Sanhedrin. Essentially, are you the Christ? Are you the King of the Jews? And Jesus replies, and he says, "Look, you're the one who said it, not me, right?" So Jesus says, "Yes, I am the Christ." And even at that, Pontius Pilate was like, "I just don't see a reason to execute him, but if you guys want, then I guess we can do this." In fact, Pontius Pilate is kind of assuming that it's just this Sanhedrin, it's just these leaders that want Jesus to be executed. And it seems as though he's gained so much favor that Pontius Pilate is actually going to leave it up to the crowd to decide whether or not Jesus should be crucified. Now, kind of in between this, in the middle of all of this, we don't see this in the book of Mark, but what happens is Jesus is actually sent over to Herod. Okay, so Jesus is sent over to Herod, who is the essentially the ruler there in Judea. He's the king of the Jews in that section. And Herod and Pontius Pilate do not get along. They do not get along. In fact, historically, until about the time that Jesus was crucified, they did not get along at all one bit. But this kind of brought them together because this gave them something to be unified about. And it says in the book of Luke that Herod was kind of enamored with Jesus because he had heard so much about who Jesus was. And so Herod brings Jesus in. Again, Herod starts questioning Jesus. Jesus gives no answer. He gives no rebuttal. He gives nothing. This kind of frustrates Herod. Herod, being kind of the bad dude that he is, essentially scourges Jesus, beats him, sends him back to Pontius Pilate and says, "Look, he's your problem, not mine." So Pontius Pilate takes Jesus before all of the people of Jerusalem, before all of these Jewish people. And he's thinking to himself, I'm ascertaining through what I see here in scripture. He's thinking to myself, look, if I bring it before the people, there's no way they're going to crucify this Jesus guy because it seems like everybody's liked him, right? Because he's done these healings, he's done all of this stuff. It's the Sanhedrin that doesn't like him. I'm going to bring it before the Jesus, before all of these people, the Jewish people. And scripture says that Pontius Pilate said, hey, here's the deal. It's either I got to release a prisoner. Do you want me to release Jesus here? Or do you want me to release this murderer by the name of Barabbas, right? Barabbas, not a good feller, right? He's not some guy you want dating your daughter, right? I mean, he's a messed up dude. And it says that the Sanhedrin, all of these leaders of the Sanhedrin, they riled up the crowd saying, we want Barabbas to be freed. They said, free Barabbas, but we want Jesus to be crucified. We want Jesus to be crucified. Now, I don't know. I would. It would have been interesting to be there as a fly on the wall. You know what were the people thinking? Were they fired up simply because the Sanhedrin had told them lies? Were they frustrated with Jesus because he claimed to do all of these things? He did all of these healings, and yet he wasn't able to really stand up and put himself in there as King of the Jews. You know why was the crowd so against this Jesus guy after all that they had seen? And there's a lot of speculation about all of that, but here's what we know is that Jesus didn't put up a fight because here's what Jesus wasn't about the temporary. He wasn't about freeing the people from the tyranny of Rome. He wasn't about making life better for his Jewish brothers and sisters. It was a much bigger purpose. See, Jesus was there for the atonement of the sins of the people. That's Jesus's purpose. It goes all the way back to the original Passover. It goes all the way back to the lamb. It goes all the way to the beginning of the story. It goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. It goes all the way back to the crushed serpent, right? This Jesus understood his purpose. And people were looking for Jesus to be their genie in a bottle, right? They wanted Jesus to solve their problems now. They wanted Jesus to swoop in and to save the day. And you know what? I think sometimes we're guilty of that same thing. We're guilty of this expectation that we want Jesus to make life better for us, when Jesus isn't here for the temporary. Jesus is here for the eternal. He's not here to make sure we have happy Tuesdays, right? He's here to make sure that when we face the judge on Judgment Day, that he looks at us in the eyes and says, "Well done, good and faithful servant." That's what Jesus is here for. You know, I have a really hard time, you know, with the political world we live in. And one of the reasons I have a hard time is because we try so hard to make America reflect our Christian values. And it's funny because I think if you go all the way back to if you go all the way back to every nation that's ever existed, right, you don't see those nations lasting long. I mean, Rome lasted for hundreds of years. America's been around for a couple of 100 years. But here's the thing that I know is that America is not eternal, right? Rome was never intended to be eternal. What is eternal is the kingdom of heaven. What is eternal is God. One of the things Paul says in the book of Philippians is he says that we are dual citizens. We are dual citizens. We are citizens of heaven, and we are also citizens here on this earth. But make no bones about it. Colossians chapter 3 says, our heart, our mind is up with God up in heaven. Like we need to make sure that we don't see this world in the same temporary way, but we view it in an eternal way. And that's what Jesus was doing for us. You know, Jesus at any point in time could have called 10,000, isn't that a song? Could have called 10,000 angels to come down and to rescue him. Jesus could have gotten himself up off of that cross at any point in time. Jesus could have answered the Sanhedrin. He could have made the Sanhedrin look foolish with your accusations and with their questions, but he chose not to. He chose not to, because when he prayed and he cried in that garden, he said, "Your will and not mine be done." And I think so many times I'm just as guilty of it, man. I want my will done, right? I want to be happy and healthy, and I want things to go well for me. And God says, you know what? It's not about you. It's about eternity. It's about eternity. So a couple of things that I want to challenge us with today. First thing is to try to view the world, view people around you through the lens of eternity. View those that are in your neighborhood. View your family, your children with the lens of eternity. View the political strife in this world. View these things through the lens of eternity, and realize that although things might not be going the way that we have an expectation that we should go, that ultimately God is in control. And Jesus, even before the Sanhedrin, even before Pontius Pilate, even before Herod, Jesus was in control the entire time. So focus in on allowing God to be the one that you look to. Allow him to control your eternity. The second thing is so many times we fight people to try to defend Jesus, right? We get in arguments with people, and I think it's very interesting that as people were blaspheming Jesus to his face, he didn't answer them. He didn't. And here's the thing. We don't have to defend Jesus. There's nothing that we have to defend him from. He's good on his own. He's got it himself. like we're not called to defend Jesus. It's very interesting because as I read through scripture and don't get me wrong, I grew up in a very fundamental, I think is one of the best ways to put it, a very fundamental church, a very fundamental background. I was always told all of the right answers to give to people, when they questioned about who Jesus is. And as I look through scripture, I'm realizing Jesus doesn't ever tell us that he needs defended. In fact, the closest thing that we have is when Peter says, in Peter chapter 3, I think chapter 3, verse 15, First Peter chapter 3, verse 4, he says, always be prepared to give a defense, not for Jesus, right? Don't always be prepared. It doesn't say always be prepared to give a defense for the inerrancy of scripture, right? Or always be prepared to give a defense for fill in the blank. I mean, fill whatever defense we have. It's just be prepared to give a defense for the hope that you have. You see, that's what we're called to live with. We're called to live by hope. We're called to live with love. We're called to live with faith. We're not called to defend Jesus. He doesn't need us defending him. He can do just fine on his own. Well, in fact, Jesus calls us to love, right? He says that they will know that we are followers of Jesus, not because we have all of the right answers. He says we'll know that we're followers of Jesus because of our love. I mean, that's all that boils down to. Right. And so many times we think, man, we've got to have the right answers. We've got to defend Jesus. We need to picket this or do that, or we need to stand up for what is right. Well, really, what God is calling us to do is just love people around us. Like I think he can defend himself. He's fine. He really is. Peter, Jesus wasn't looking for Peter to come in and save the day and answer for him. He was just wanting Peter to be there. Right. Like he knew, and he still loved Peter, even when Peter failed, and God still loves us, no matter what, in all circumstances. That's who he is. So I challenge the church, right? Like, live like Jesus, be like Jesus. He doesn't need defended. You don't need to defend him. Live like Jesus, love like Jesus. When people are trying to pinpoint you or put you into a box, just live it. Just be who you are. Christian, just be the follower of who God tells you to be, and always be ready to give a defense for the hope that you have, in Jesus Christ. All right, have a fabulous week. Rock on this week. May God bless you.